Hello, I'm here with Professor Bradon Ellem, author of Labour and Megaprojects, Rethinking Productivity and Industrial Relations Policy. Professor Ellem, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Michael. Great to talk to you about this work.
The article's starting point, I thought, was disrupting an orthodox story about the Gorgon project. The Gorgon project is a very large liquefied natural gas extraction project off the coast of Western Australia. And there's an orthodox story that you claim in the literature that says that this mega project, one, has gone very badly. It cost much more than was estimated, and there were big delays before first gas appeared. And secondly, that these problems with the project were largely related to problems with the workers, things like moves made by relevant unions, the cost of labour, productivity of labour, and issues relating to agreement making around the project. So as an entry point, I thought for this interview, could you tell us why you reject those accounts and how you understand the failures of the project instead?
I think there are two starting points for me, Michael. The first is that these kinds of delays are absolutely standard, and these kinds of cost increases are absolutely standard. Perhaps a more common example that people would know about, which creates a lot of debate, is the cost of hosting the Olympic Games, for example. And I think we would find it hard to think of a major infrastructure process that doesn't involve delays and doesn't involve more costs than originally thought. If you start from that point of view, then what you're looking at with this project, the Gorgon project, is trying to find the particular reasons for a general phenomenon. So the second point of departure for me, and here I guess I put my industrial relations hat back on, and I look more closely than the media did and the complainants did at the cost structures on the project. And it literally doesn't add up. We're talking about a project with a $17 billion US dollars blowout in costs, but where the maritime labour costs, which is where all the debate was and the pillaring of the maritime union, the maritime costs are less than 1% of the total project cost. Now, I spend a lot of time explaining this in the paper, and maybe I spend too much time on it, to be honest, because it's pretty clear that the wage increases simply could not have accounted for a massive, massive increase in the project costs overall. And Michael, even leaving that aside, the amounts of money, the earnings that were thrown around in the press, was just for. I looked at the enterprise agreements that covered the work. I even looked at workers' tax returns, and there are all these stories about cooks being paid $350,000. And apart from the people bursting out laughing when I asked them about this, their reaction was, "Gee, I wish I was such a person." No such person was to be found. So do you see what I mean? That for whatever reason, a bunch of people in the media and the politicians and some employers were saying the costs were much greater than they were. But even if that was a legitimate argument, it still wouldn't account for the huge increase in the costs of the project. And the other thing that you asked me about, just quickly, is the delays. And there are delays for all sorts of reasons with big picture things going wrong. One of the vessels on the project ran into a submarine, and it was impounded, and it cost them $10 million or something to have to pay the Australian government. There were delays because of sea swells, because of weather, because of quarantining, and little delays on particular work sites, all of which added up over time to increase the costs and to blow out the timeline.
Well, okay. I understand why politicians and maybe newspapers would develop these stories, but if the falsehoods are that big, both on the micro level, we can't find anyone that was being paid $350,000 to be a cook, or on the macro level, it just doesn't add up clearly that labour costs can account for a $17 billion blowout. What does this appear? Do these lines appear in the academic literature as well? And how would you explain that if they do?
No, there's not so much of that line of inquiry in the academic literature. There's not much in industrial relations. In the mega project literature there is, and it's explained by some Scandinavian researchers in terms essentially, and again, it's probably not surprising, to lay readers or experts or anybody else, that in the initial phases of trying to sell a project, be it to governments or investors or whomever, essentially people overpromise the returns and understate the costs and the difficulties. And it's called the optimism bias, and it's been well documented across a 30 or 40 year time period since World War II. So again, to me, this is a particular manifestation of it.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, this is really on the empirical interventions you make. I would actually say that the main contribution of the paper, for me at least, was more in the realm of methodology. And you do a couple of really interesting things that I wanted to draw out a bit. The methodological insight is laid on top of an analytical insight. The analytical insight is that you claim that labor is a source of value in megaprojects. And I was wondering what you meant by that. And then methodologically, on top of this claim, you say that labor offers insights into the workings of megaprojects, which is more something about epistemology or methodology. So I was wondering if you could break down those two claims and explain the link for us.
Sure. And they're probably related as well, but the most literal sense of labour as a source of value is simply to point out that without labour, you don't have the project. You have the resource, you have the capacities of the employers, you have the investment and so on, but you do actually, of course, need labour. And it's interesting, in so much discussion about industrial relations policy in Australia today more broadly, labour, broadly defined, is cast as a problem. What I'm looking at here, as you're saying, is labour in its most literal sense, labour as workers, labour as employees. And of course, it sounds like a self-evident thing to say, but you do need to have this labour to produce the value for the employers. So in the most literal economic sense, I'm pointing to labour as being, in economic terms, a source, some people would say the source of value, out of which comes, in this particular case, this project. And then related to that, as you say, is the second point, which is perhaps maybe more innovative, which is to say that the skills and the commitment that workers bring to these kinds of projects, and quite clearly documented, I hope, in the paper, in this particular project, are actually really interesting. And I suppose it's an old debate that goes back to the origins of Taylorism and to how much skill workers actually do bring to particular jobs. But the scores of employees that I talked to had a common theme, which was that they felt that they were being undervalued, and not in that economic sense, not about how much they were being paid, whether they were a cook or not, whoever it might have been. Their argument was that typically they felt undervalued because their experience, their skills, their expertise, none of that was being sufficiently drawn upon. And their argument, I suppose in some ways it's a very traditional argument that skilled workers have been running through generations of industrial capitalism. What I thought was really striking in this particular study was that these workers saw themselves, by and large, as actually trying to make the project work, as trying to make it a success. And some of them explicitly said to me in focus groups and interviews, if we do a good job on this project, then that's great for us because it means there'll be more such projects and there'll be more such work. And I find that really interesting because that's exactly the argument that employers and the federal government use when they're trying to change legislation, isn't it? That we have to have reliable workers in Australia or we won't get investment. These workers were saying, in effect, yeah, we agree with that and we are reliable and we know there are problems on the project and we can explain to you why there are problems. It's not us. We can explain to you the structure of some of the contracting arrangements. We can explain to you how particular sites are being managed that we think could be done better. I found that really quite compelling and interesting.
Yeah, I found it really compelling as well. It speaks to a number of important debates that I think we're going to continue having as we go forward. Things like the rise of automation. More and more workers are going to face these problems of not like undervaluation, not in relation to wages necessarily, but in other ways. I also think it speaks to a very interesting set of questions about what workers in a modern advanced economy need to be. I did an interview yesterday for another of our papers, which centered on this discourse that it's very important to the Australian economy that a worker in the modern economy is flexible. But at the same time, we've got this discourse of a modern worker needs to be reliable. And there's sort of increasing and maybe at some point a little contradictory requirements coming. But it's a really great intervention. I guess as a last question, is this an intervention into the field of industrial relations as a whole? Are the insights that you're bringing here about the workers offering insights into the working of megaprojects, are the claims you make about megaprojects or say greenfield agreements, these sorts of areas in particular, or do you think we should be doing industrial relations differently as a discipline?
Yeah, I think, yes, I hope it speaks to broader questions. As you know, there's been at least a generation of debate in Australia premised on the assumption that if we get the bargaining frameworks right, if we get the industrial relations policies right, then we can unlock all sorts of potential for productivity gains, for a better economy, and also deal with some of the issues that you were just talking about, Michael. But within that industrial relations debate, there actually is not much evidence at all that links the way the law is to these kinds of economic outcomes. There really isn't. And all sorts of people have recognised that, the lack of a link. I think that's important, but what I'm trying to do, as you're implying, is to do something else as well. And that is to say, well, say if that is the case, then isn't the next step to situate work in the particular context that it takes place, where it's happening, what sort of work it is. In this case, yeah, it is about mega projects. It is offshore work in the gas industry, but it could be anywhere. And I think it's important to think more carefully about the nature of the work that's actually being done, how it's being done, where it's being done, what sort of workers are involved in particular areas of work, and bring all of those questions which scholars in other disciplines examine, really. We're talking about, in this case, mega project researchers, but also geographers, workplace sociologists, people who understand the labour process. Bring all this sort of scholarship back into the debate about industrial relations policy. So it's not just important, essential as that is, it's not just about the policies themselves.
Yeah, I think the paper stands as a very compelling argument for, I guess, interdisciplinary industrial relations work.
That's what I'm trying to do. So I hope it comes across like that. That's what
it did for me. Okay, well, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much. That was really interesting.
Thanks, Michael.
The paper is available at the Economic and Labour Relations Review. There will be a link posted underneath the video. Thank you so much.
Thank you.